So I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today, for whom we're all very excited because of his depth of knowledge on a number of issues, international and national. I happen to have known this gentleman now for the past 12 years, and if you were to look up a gentleman and a scholar in the dictionary, you would find Kevin's picture. He's too good to be true, that's all I can say. A very erudite individual. And rather than being sort of a stern academic, I've learned over the past few years that that's merely a facade. Kevin is really not even a closet nerd, he's a nerd. And like myself, enjoys all things Star Trek and Star Wars and Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy. And it's just so rare to see those qualities mixed into one person. So he's now known, of course, as Professor Kevin MacKay, and he's a faculty member of the School of Communications and Global Studies at Mohawk College of Applied Arts and Technology. He researches, writes, and speaks on the topics of societal collapse, systemic risk, and political transformation. In 2017, he published a book entitled Radical Transformation, Oligarchy, Collapse, and the Crisis of Civilization. And other good news. He is currently working on a book titled A New Ecological Politics with Oregon State University Press. So Kevin is also a union leader with the Ontario Public Service Employees Union and currently serving as Vice President of the Mohawk College Faculty Union, and as a delegate to OPSU, to the Canadian Association of University Teachers. He served 3 terms on the provincial executive of OPSU College faculty and was a member of the 2017 provincial bargaining team that won academic freedom for faculty at 24 Ontario colleges. That's an important milestone. Kevin is also a member of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War and executive director of the Sky Dragon Community Development Cooperative. And I certainly hope he attracts a lot of sky dragons. Just recently, Kevin has founded an organization entitled Canadian Academics for a Just Foreign Policy. And now I invite you to join me in welcoming Kevin MacKay.
Thanks so much, Steve, for the very kind words. So I'm just going to do a little bit of arranging of the microphone here. Is that okay? Can people hear? Pretty good? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Super. So I am going to have some notes in front of me, although I'm going to color outside of the lines a little bit too at times, and just try and speak, I guess, more directly to the group that's here. And I first just want to say how amazing it is to, over the years, be able to come back to this fellowship. Obviously, I have a damn good reason to come to Sarnia, which is my mom and Steve and my sister. But this group has been just a wonderful, constant example, I think, of so many of the things that we need to do in this country. And particularly given the current circumstances and what I'll be talking about today, the fact that this is a cross-border fellowship is incredibly important. And I think it's indicative of what Steve said, which I really firmly believe that, the American people are not our enemy. And if anything, I think they're allies in what for them is the struggle of their lives right now. So I just want to start out by sort of saying that. So I am going to hopefully call up, I guess I have to turn my mouse on. Okay, there we go. Let me just get this open here. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on a talk that I gave on March 12th, so fairly recently, for the Canadian Association, Canadian Academics for a Just Foreign Policy. It's so new, I don't even know the name. It was an event we did called Canada in the Age of Trump, national sovereignty and foreign policy in a multipolar world. And so we had 4 speakers, and it was a great event. It was well attended, and basically it was 4 academics speaking on the issue of what's been happening over the last few months. So without further ado, folks, I'm going to jump in. So since January 20th, 2025, the world has taken on an almost surreal quality. After Trump's inauguration, it soon became clear that this would be no business as usual Republican government. But instead, we're witnessing a far-right authoritarian regime seeking to radically remake the American state. Headed by unelected tech oligarch Elon Musk, Trump's team has moved with unholy vigor to attack state institutions and to enact sweeping changes to foreign policy. The collapse of the American left, and particularly within the Democratic Party, is really what enabled this takeover, and has resulted in, as of yet, no organized opposition to the march of American neo-fascism. And I don't think it's an overstatement to call this neo-fascism in terms of what we're witnessing in Trump's politics. So currently, neither the left nor the liberal class in the United States are providing a coherent alternative to Trump's right-wing populism. The former due to weakness, the latter due to their essentially neoliberal character. And so what I mean there is that, the liberal class in the United States for decades now has really been wedded to the same sort of neoliberal capitalist model as has the Republicans. What does this mean? It means tax cuts for the wealthy. It means, not looking after working class people's issues in terms of raising minimum wages, protecting unions, that sort of thing. Both the Democrats and Republicans have been doing this for decades now, and that's partly what's precipitated this crisis. Instead, both groups, both the left and the liberals, seem stunned and utterly disarmed in the face of Trump's attacks on the state and on civil rights. Since their total capture by corporate power in the 1980s and 1990s, both the Democratic and Republican parties have alienated the majority of American working class voters. And this has led to the rise of an outsider populist politics. It was expressed on the left by Bernie Sanders and, of course, on the right by Donald Trump. And the Democratic Party's sabotage of Bernie Sanders' 2 campaigns reveals a really uncomfortable truth, which is that the donor class of the Democrats would rather embrace American neo-fascism than allow a traditional social democrat to win the presidency. As radical as the Americans thought Bernie was, really all he was talking about was a lot of the policies we have here in Canada today. So actually not that radical at all. We call them, an old school Canadian social democrat like Tommy Douglas, for instance. But again, the wealthy elite in the States didn't want to see that happen. So instead, they created the possibility of Donald Trump. On the Republican side, despite the fact that many in the party privately despise Trump, and this is well known, they have fallen in line nonetheless in a demonstration of fear, rank opportunism, and also, of course, the promise of deep tax cuts. Because one of the things Trump will deliver, like he did in his first term, is tax cuts for the wealthy. So I think it's important, first of all, to understand that the seriousness of the crisis that the United States is in right now is real and it's dire. And I don't think it's an over-exaggeration to suggest that the future of American democracy itself is at stake. Now, of course, for Canadians, the chaos of Trump has had a surprisingly direct and personal impact. Trump's recent threats against our country are a mask-off moment, with our supposed friend and neighbor to the south being revealed instead as the belligerent imperial power that it actually is. The difference now, though, is that Trump is directing the politics of threat and coercion against erstwhile allies like Canada, Mexico, and the EU states, and not just against the usual national enemies, Russia, China, Iran, and poor black and brown people in the global south. This is usually what US aggression is directed against, these groups. And so the first thing that I think it's difficult for Canadians to sometimes really wrap our heads around is that the United States is in fact an aggressive imperial power. It is an empire. It has been since World War II. We don't hear that a lot in Canadian media. We're maybe going to hear more of it in the next couple of months. And it's always been a really difficult subject to broach among Canadians, right? Partly because we view them as our friend and neighbor to the south, right? Where really around the world, this is not news at all, right? I mean, several countries have directly experienced economic destabilization, sanctions, military intervention, coups, assassinations, you name it, right? Over and over again, committed by the United States. And so Canada's just feeling this really for the first time. We're feeling the horrible thought of having this massive power directed our way with ill intent. So we should make no mistake, Trump's threats against Canada are unprecedented in our history. We've had trade wars in the past. I'm sure a lot of us can remember the softwood lumber issues we had, decades ago in Canada. So we've had trade wars before, but never like this. Trump has said he wants to bring Canada to its knees. He's repeatedly said that he wants Canada to become the 51st state, and has addressed former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as Governor Trudeau. When asked if Trump planned on using military force to annex Canada, this was in an interview, a media interview, he replied that the United States didn't have to because they'll annex Canada using economic force. So he didn't say, no, we're not going to annex Canada. He just said, no, we don't have to use the military. We'll just bring the country to their knees through economic force. And apart from general threats, Trump has made more specific comments regarding the Treaty of 1908. Just going to move this a little bit. And this is the treaty that finally fixed the borders between Canada and the United States after the Revolutionary War, after the War of 1812. And so Trump says he wants to revisit this treaty. So basically, according to Trump, it doesn't matter that this is a treaty that's been on the books for over 100 years. He's just like, yeah, it's time to revisit that. Who says the borders should be where they are? He's also said he wants to revisit how the Great Lakes are divided up as well. So again, these are very tangible things that he's stating apart from his generalized comments of annexation in the 51st state. And so I think the threats against Canada need to be understood within the entirety of Trump's comments over the past few months. So during this time, he's continually stated that the United States needs to secure valuable natural resources and that they're willing to use force to do so. This explains both his attempt to shake down Ukraine for control of its natural resources, and also it explains his threats against Greenland, Mexico, Panama, and Canada. And so for Canadians, the implications of these threats, I think, are very clear. Trump wants our territory and he wants our resources. So never before have Canadians experienced this kind of direct assault on our sovereignty from the United States or really from any other country. And so in my talk, I'm going to talk about 4 aspects of this challenge. First, in order to respond effectively to Trump's threats, I think we first need to ascertain how serious they are. Should they be understood as mere bluster, or do they instead present an existential threat to the Canadian state? Because you'll hear different things in the media and just in talking to people on a daily basis. Second, after ascertaining the degree of threat, how serious is it, we need to consider the Canadian response to date and assess its effectiveness. Next, we need to really understand the broader context of the crisis that we're facing. And this includes the geopolitical realities of American imperial decline, emerging multipolarity, and the return of what realist political scientists call great power politics. So all these things are really important to understand to make sense of the present moment. And finally, I'm going to argue that an effective response to the trade war and the threats to our sovereignty can only come from the Canadian left. The right, with its long commitments to neoliberal internationalism, so with the free trade, breaking down trade barriers and labor laws and environmental protections globally. And also the right's commitment to deep American political, economic, and military integration. We saw this under Stephen Harper to an unprecedented extent. That's when our militaries became almost seamlessly interoperable. That's when the FBI and CIA could operate on Canadian soil. So the right has a history of this in Canada. And also the right has a history of eroding national institutions. Harper breaking up and selling off the wheat borders is one example. And so for this reason, I really think that that political force is utterly incapable of confronting the current crisis. Trump presents both a challenge and an opportunity to the left. Are we able to realize a progressive vision of Canadian nationalism, capable of defending our sovereignty, while simultaneously moving forward on important goals of economic justice, democratic reform, truth and reconciliation, and ecological sustainability? And I think that Canada's future will depend on our success or failure in this task. So in terms of how we should interpret Trump's threats, it's hard to know how seriously to take the outrageous comments that Trump's been making, the attacks on our sovereignty. Because on the one hand, it's an established pattern with Trump that he conducts diplomacy by first using threats and intimidation to destabilize the opposing party and to exact concessions in the negotiation process. So this is classic hardball negotiation tactics, in which you seek leverage in the form of superior power. So this is very different from a sort of win-win version of negotiations. It's negotiations through asserting a dominant position and basically threatening your counterpart. So in this interpretation, it is possible that Trump's threats against Canada are just an extreme form of hardball negotiation tactics, which will never be fully acted on. So this is one interpretation. The trade war to date has been a high-stakes game of threat, counter-threat, revision, retraction, and renewed threat. So this seesaw aspect, and the many times where Trump's threats were not fully realized, lends some support to this perspective. For instance, Trump originally announced a 25% tariff on all imported Canadian goods across the board, but he later retracted it. On March 12th, 25% tariffs were levied on Canadian aluminum and steel, but the past months has seen threats of 100% tariffs, 50% tariffs, and shifting deadlines for the implementation of tariffs. So given all of this, there is some evidence to support the perspective that what Canadians are experiencing right now is just a very brutal round of trade negotiations. However, a contrasting interpretation of Trump's threats can't be ignored. In the chaos of Trumpism and of American imperial decline, radical geopolitical realignments are very possible. Enemies can become allies, and a former ally can become, as White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt recently called Canada, a competitor. In this light, American threats against Canada may in fact be deadly serious. And evidence for the second interpretation is that, of course, apart from threats, Trump has actually made good at leveling steep tariffs against Canadian exports to the United States. So clearly the threats weren't just rhetoric, but are being backed up by radical changes to trade policy and, the kicking off of a proper trade war. And another factor to consider is that what we're hearing from Trump now is just the first glimpse of a predatory, protectionist, nakedly imperialist current within the America First movement. And this current may not yet fully be able to realize itself in outright economic or military war against Canada. I'm not saying I don't think these things are imminent. However, I do think that if economic and political contradictions within the United States continue to deepen, and if Americans face real crisis and upheaval at home, that the likelihood of predatory behavior towards Canada becomes much more likely. And so when considering the two possibilities, that Trump's threats are just a negotiation tactic, or that they represent a real threat to Canadian sovereignty, we may hope for the first, and I certainly do, but I think we have to seriously prepare for the second. So when we look at the response to date, Canadian politicians were at first slow to react to Trump's inflammatory rhetoric. Early responses from Prime Minister Trudeau struck a note of appeasement, with commitments to devote more resources to the essential non-issue of fentanyl entering the United States. Pointing a fentanyl czar was all just performative, right? Basically trying to just appease Trump. Because of course you see how Trump uses these tactics when he's in the media trying to negotiate. He'll attack his opponent. There can be limited to no truth behind the attack, but he likes to use hot button things, for instance, like calling all immigrants rapists and murderers and that sort of stuff, all the people coming in from the South. So we initially try to appease, and signaled a willingness to address US trade concerns. And even the Canadian public at first seemed a bit shocked and bemused, like almost as if we're watching some sort of strange movie unfold. Trump's first few quips about the 51st state and Governor Trudeau were met with disbelief and derision. However, when the comments continued, escalated, and were coupled with actual tariffs, the popular mood in Canada has begun to shift. In the place of dismissal and affront, anger has started to grow. From a tone of appeasement, Canadian federal political leaders also have shifted to one of defiance and a commitment to fight back against the US threats. Prime Minister Trudeau announced that former Prime Minister Trudeau announced that any tariffs imposed on Canadian exports would be accompanied by retaliatory tariffs on American goods coming into Canada. And on March 13th, the federal government enacted a tariff package on $28.9 billion worth of US imports. In addition, the federal government is looking at how oil and gas exports from Canada to the United States might be reduced or even halted. And Canada, for instance, is the largest exporter of oil to the United States at about 4 million barrels a day. Pierre Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh, the other leaders of the federal parties, so did Elizabeth May actually, also made strong statements condemning the US economic threats and all called for retaliatory measures. And in addition, several provincial premiers have responded to the American tariffs with retaliatory measures. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford threatened to impose a 25% surcharge on energy produced in the province and purchased by the United States. Now, Ford eventually agreed to halt the surcharge when Trump agreed to reduce steel and aluminum tariffs from 50% to 25%. So there has been this back and forth brinksmanship that's been happening. But at least our politicians have sort of seemed to have woken up and are fighting back. However, amidst this response, some fault lines have also been revealed. So for instance, among the premiers, Alberta's right-wing premier Danielle Smith initially struck a much more conciliatory note with Trump. Smith eventually got on board with retaliatory tariffs, but she has flatly refused to consider placing an export tax on Alberta oil or affecting exports of Alberta oil at all to the US. So there's definitely, we're not all singing from the same songbook exactly across country. In terms of Canadian public opinion, polling soon showed a sharp decline in views of the United States and a sharp increase in nationalist sentiment. So a February 6th Angus Reid national poll showed that the number of people responding that they were very proud or proud of being Canadian increased from a level of 58% in November 2024 to 67% in February of this year. In contrast, a March Legger poll showed that 63% of Canadians feel that the United States is going in the wrong direction. This is up from 50% in July of 2024. As well, a robust Buy Canadian movement has also emerged across the country. And this can be seen on social media platforms, in grocery stores, and also in real cross-border traffic. So for instance, in towns like ours, Sarnia, Canadians would regularly cross the border to shop in Port Huron, but there's evidence that these numbers are way down now, and that even local politicians are encouraging us to stay at home and shop locally. So there's a consumer response happening, a consumer backlash among Canadians. And there's also a cultural backlash growing against Trump threats. So, recent NHL hockey games have seen American teams being booed by Canadian crowds. Canadian comedian Mike Myers recently launched a countrywide message of defiance on Saturday Night Live by saying "elbows up," a reference to hockey legend Gordie Howe, and symbolizing the need for Canadians to mobilize and fight back to protect our country. So the response from the Canadian political and public classes have been slow to build, almost like a body being invaded by a malignant virus in which it takes a while for the immune system to kick in. However, the response is now robust and I think appropriately belligerent. Faced with the existential threat of being attacked by an aggressive imperial power, Canadians have realized the importance of our sovereignty. No matter how imperfect Canada is, and no matter how much we disagree on, it seems like we can all agree that becoming a colony of the United States would be a far worse proposition. However, while the national immune response we are now witnessing is hopeful, in its current form, I'll argue that it won't be enough to inoculate us against the real threat of US economic and military aggression. For Canada to have a fighting chance, it's critical that we understand the objective nature of the threat we face, the historic forces that have led to it, and the realistic possibilities we have for confronting it. Conservative and liberal politics are severely limited and ultimately incapable of providing this understanding. And this is where, again, a left analysis and a left politics can help us. So first, we have to separate out Trump the buffoon, this character that's larger than life, lying every second word, blustering. We have to separate that character out from the deeper geostrategic forces that are actually driving the United States to retrench in the Americas. People might have heard this whole idea of Fortress America. This is something that's being talked about in Trump world, and it's the idea of literally making North America an entire sort of defended, unified zone. And so political and economic facts on the ground point to a real crisis within US capitalism and imperialism. So this talk isn't just coming out of thin air, and it's dangerous to assume this is just Trump that's behind this. So to begin with, the US imports 80% of its rare earth and critical minerals. So these are minerals like nickel, cobalt, copper, lithium, graphite, and tungsten. They also import their potash. And one of the largest suppliers of these minerals is China. And China also controls much of the supply chain that brings critical minerals to the US from other countries. So what China doesn't supply directly it also controls the supply chains from the other countries that supply these minerals to the United States. Canada, of course, is also an important supplier of minerals, water, oil, and electricity to the United States, and in particular, potash. Of course, potash is incredibly important in producing fertilizer. And so the issue the States faces is that its main competitors, such as Russia and China, are far more self-sufficient in relation to these key resources. And this relative lack of key natural resources puts hard limits on US imperial power. I mean, literally, it's going to be unable to maintain its military, to maintain its ability to project force if it doesn't have access to these minerals. And because of that, this is leading to increasingly desperate attempts by American oligarchs to secure these key inputs. As well, the growth of the BRICS bloc and the looming threat of global de-dollarization also present direct challenges to American capitalist imperialism. So since World War II, the United States foreign policy has centered on controlling international affairs in its own interests. It used political, economic, and military power to do so, and was able to sustain a worldwide network of military bases and numerous wars of choice, basically, through relying on the strength of the dollar, the US dollar, as the global reserve currency. And of course, I think we've probably heard of the petrodollar. This is basically the idea that years ago, just after World War II, the Americans made a deal with Saudi Arabia that all of their oil transactions would only be done in US dollars. Other oil-producing countries followed suit. And so, of course, oil being the substance which powers the global economy, every country around the world then scrambled to secure US dollars as part of their country's reserves. What this meant is you had countries all over the world continually buying US treasuries and US bonds. And this enabled the US to basically just print money because it knew that it was going to get more, like it was always going to have a supply, a market for its dollars. And this is all changing. With the BRICS alternative trade and financial architecture emerging, governments worldwide are now shedding US dollars at an accelerating rate. This process will end the ability of the United States to finance yearly massive budget deficits and also to finance its $36 trillion national debt. So it is facing a serious, serious debt crisis in the years to come. At the same time, since the 1980s, neoliberal capitalism has hollowed out American manufacturing. So of course they offshored all their manufacturing. This was part of neoliberal capitalism, was like part of globalization, was that if you're producing something, you can produce it cheaper in Singapore or China or India or whatnot, you move your factory, right? So, but the downside is the US no longer has this manufacturing capacity. They've also crushed their labor movement. I mean, the US labor movement is about as third as powerful and as prevalent in its coverage than it is in Canada. And finally, this neoliberal capitalism has steadily eroded the welfare state. So we've seen tax cuts, cuts to Social Security, all of these things, cuts to education, are profound in the United States. China is now the world's manufacturing superpower. It's not even close. They manufacture way more than the United States does. And the United States is unable to compete in terms of the real economy of goods and services. And that's in contrast to the financial economy. Or the tech economy. So if you look at the United States, the massive amount of their GDP is really in three sectors. It's the tech sector, it's financial services, and it's the military, right? So the military doesn't really produce anything it produces things that are going to be blown up and destroyed. So it's not like it's producing, cars and fridges and homes and stuff like that. The tech sector, that's real economy, but also it's not as labor intensive. You're not producing things in the same way that, for instance, a country like China is. So the U.S. economy they'd say the fundamentals are very soft in the sense of like actual economic power. And also the U.S. is not even able to compete anymore in terms of producing military hardware. And this is being demonstrated in the Ukraine war, where Russia is currently outproducing the entire collective West on a yearly basis. It's not even close. If you took the U.S. out of the equation, it would be like almost 5-1. They're outproducing Europe. And again, it's because the U.S. simply doesn't have the manufacturing. Even though they still call themselves the largest military on the planet, they probably technically still are. Although again, Russia and China are getting very close, but they're unable to ramp up production in the way that Russia was able to do, because Russia basically just said, "Do it." Right? That's an authoritarian government. They were able to sort of do that. So the states can't do that either. And so for decades, the US was able to overcome these shortcomings by these domestic contradictions through its imperialist adventures, through extorting less powerful countries for their resources and bullying competitors through economic sanctions. So while its fundamentals were declining, it was relying more and more on imperialism, relying more and more on sort of this gangsterism to extract wealth from other countries. But now that these strategies are beginning to fail, the domestic situation in the US will only deteriorate, leading to economic crises and political upheaval. And so thousands of years of history have taught us that the end of empire, which is what we're witnessing, is a chaotic, unstable process that can lead to acute domestic and international crises. The unraveling of the US empire and the intensification of internal contradictions caused by neoliberal capitalism and by an imperialist foreign policy, they're already leading to destabilization. This includes a crisis of legitimacy of the oligarchic class. So people don't trust elites at all in the United States, whether it's Democrat, Republican. Leading to massive political polarization and to the emergence of radical political movements, which is exactly what Trump's movement is, radical right-wing populist political movement. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that Trump is the result of these structures, not their primary cause, right? Trump is a manifestation of these underlying issues. Another lesson of history is that although multipolarity, and when I say multipolarity, just to unpack that a little bit, this is in contrast to a unipolar world. A unipolar world is really what political scientists identified from World War II up until, let's say, a couple years ago. And during that time frame, there was one country that was seeking to exert dominance over the whole globe. It was the United States. So one unipolar means one pole of power, right? Well, that world is over. And even, US officials, even Trump's own cabinet members have admitted this. Marco Rubio is like, yeah, that world is over, it's done. We now are living in a multipolar world, which means there's several centers of power around the world, right? And so, even though you could argue that that's a necessary step away from the failed project of American global dominance, multipolarity alone brings no guarantee of a more stable, ethical, sustainable, or just world. Instead, as I mentioned earlier on, we seem to be witnessing the return of great power politics, in which three global superpowers, the US, Russia, and China, maintain political and economic spheres of influence. This is, again, this Fortress America idea. This is why the US is trying to control the area around it. Now, of the triad of the US, Russia, and China, the United States is the outlier. And the reason for this is that the interests of Russia and China have already been fused together in opposition to American aggression, causing these two countries to subsume their competition to mutual benefit. So this is the interesting thing about empire. Empire sows the seeds of its own destruction. By the US attacking Russia and China so vigorously, Russia and China were like, okay, we can see what's going on. We're going to form an alliance. And this is the closest alliance these countries have ever had, even more so than when the Soviet Union and communist China were in alliance briefly before that broke down. This is a very tight, far-ranging alliance. And so, their response in the form of BRICS, because this is really, Russia, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil. This new power bloc presents an insurmountable obstacle to continued US global dominance. They just can't outcompete Russia and China combined, plus the BRICS. And so the real question is whether the United States, in the face of this, can realize this in time, right? Can realize this changing world, realize that the dream of empire is over. And can they transition democratically into a regional power that exists in peace with its neighbors? This would be the goal, the ideal goal, right, in this transformation. However, instead of a democratic and peaceful dissolution of the US empire, in a new geopolitical order organized around competing great powers, Trump appears to be pursuing a strategy of regional imperialism, securing the resources that American oligarchs need by dominating or annexing surrounding nations, Mexico, Canada, Greenland, Panama. So in this dangerous new phase of international relations, Canada's greatest vulnerability is our proximity to a dying empire. We're right on the border. while this is happening. So to talk about, what kind of response might be possible, might be actually able to threat, facing with simply a trade dispute with a uniquely bombastic leader, then, conservative politicians like Doug Ford can strike the right note in responding to Trump's threats. And as much as I personally really don't like Doug Ford, you got to give him credit. He's been, kind of belligerent in pushing back against Trump. However, if the more serious possibility of U.S. aggression is ever realized, then I think that relying on the likes of Doug Ford, Art Carney, Pierre Poilievre, or Danielle Smith will be fatal. And this is because, the right has no answer to the existential threat placed or presented by the U.S. and its imperialist designs on Canada. First, Canadian political and economic elites are as likely to be compradors in an American takeover as they are allies in resisting it. And so that term comprador has been used for decades to talk about when a country colonizes another country. So for instance, when Britain, took over India and established the British Raj, the comprador class in India were the wealthy Indian elite who were like, yeah, we'll play along with the colonial takeover, right? Because it'll benefit us. So they're kind of like traders, right? And you see this over and over again through imperialism, colonialism. When a country takes over another country, there's usually a domestic segment of the ruling class that goes along with it. So what I'm suggesting is we may hate to think this, but a certain amount of our elite class would probably go along with American takeover. So again, we can't look to them as a final solution to that, a final answer to that problem. And second, as I've mentioned before, Canadian history clearly shows that conservative governments destroy public institutions and national capacity. They don't build them. Historically, it's been the NDP that's been the main political driver of Canadian nation building, often in alliance with the Liberals and more recently with the Bloc. However, even today, the NDP platform is far from what would be required to actually enhance Canadian sovereignty and political and economic autonomy from the United States. Instead, what Canada needs today is a coordinated project of nation building with economic, political, and military aspects. The challenge of the left is to articulate a vision of national identity in a concrete nation building project that is democratic, socialist, and ecologically sustainable. So what would this look like? Well, aspects of this vision would include import substitution and the reshoring of manufacturing. So once more producing things in Canada. Import substitution means looking at those key items that are most heavily imported from the United States and explicitly developing domestic industries that produce those goods, right? It also involves things like federal industrial policy and government investment in key industries. So it means actually the government looking at the national economy and identifying key areas that need investment and actually facilitating that, flowing funds, improving research and development. It means Canada building ships, Canada building airplanes, Canada building wind turbines and solar panels, Canada building our own cars, not just sort of US branch plant cars. I mean, we're one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated, most technologically advanced countries on the planet. We could do all this stuff. We don't right now, and that's a huge problem. So we have to start looking at these things. We also may need to look at the nationalization of key industries, including aspects of primary resource extraction, energy production, transportation, and banking. Again, many countries around the world, their key industries, so for instance, their oil industry, or maybe it's potash or whatever, uranium mining, will actually be government owned. They'll be nationalized, specifically to protect them from, predatory, vulnerability to external powers. We also have to look at selectively protectionist economic policies. So for instance, to protect our local agricultural industries, right? So Trump's using tariffs, we're gonna have to look at using tariffs ourselves strategically to protect certain industries. A big one is removing barriers to interprovincial trade. So I'm sure a lot of people have been hearing about this as this has unfolded, the trade war, is that it's absurdly more difficult to trade between the provinces in Canada than it is to trade north-south with the States. It makes no sense. So we should obviously be tearing down those barriers. And another thing we really need to look at is improving Canadian transportation networks, linking the country east-west via a high-speed rail link. And again, so many countries around the world, much smaller than us, much less economic power, have super sophisticated high-speed rail. I have a friend recently who came back from a trip to China, and he said it's literally unbelievable. China's a big country, right? Not quite as big as Canada, but still pretty big. And you can just blast across that country in like 3 hours going 350 miles an hour. He said it's the most bizarre thing, and it feels like you're floating. So this is super sophisticated tech, which we could totally do as a country if we chose to. So we can do a lot domestically in terms of our economy, but we also need to have a shift in our foreign policy, and this is a really important one. So, during this time, it behooves us to maintain as friendly as possible relations with the United States. However, while also moving steadily in the direction of autonomy. So to this extent, the argument I'm going to make is it's almost like Canada has to fully grow up as a country. We started out as a colony of the British Empire. We still technically, have a king. I have thoughts about that. I won't get into it right now. But anyway, the idea of Canada becoming a fully formed republic that stands on its own 2 feet, that's an independent country that has its own foreign policy, I think it's high time we did this. So this would involve diversifying our trade relationships, including with the BRICS, with the European Union, with Mexico, with South America. It would be reinforcing the importance of the United Nations and international law, and Canada actually has really not been that great at that recently. This would mean no more Canadian support for US attempts to attack, destabilize, or sanction other sovereign states. It would also mean no more support for the American-backed genocide being committed by Israel against the Palestinians. We are completely isolated in the world on this issue. We're slowly moving more towards the global consensus, but still, we're not doing what we should be doing. The ICJ rulings on the conflict there, where they said there's plausible evidence of genocide, Canada did this ridiculous thing of saying, well, we support the court, but not the decision, which is like the lamest equivocation possible, right? Either you support international law or you don't, right? And again, we have to think about this. If all of a sudden we're under attack, what are we going to be screaming and crying about? We're going to be screaming and crying about sovereignty and international law and all these things that, sadly, if you look at our recent history, we haven't really taken very seriously, right? But we can change that. Just because we haven't done it in the past doesn't mean we can't do it going forward. We basically need to break with the American empire by becoming a neutral country with an independent foreign policy. This would include things that, again, right now seem pretty controversial, such as withdrawing from NATO and NORAD and improving relations with China and Russia, the countries we're taught to hate and fear on a daily basis in North America. I think for some reasons, but in a lot of cases just for pure fantasy, just to support US imperial aims. And I think these may sound like radical changes, but the alternative, if we want to stay linked to the United States, is we know what the price is then. We have to go along with their imperial adventures. We have to sanction the countries they don't like, right? We have to continue to be belligerent with all of the national enemies of the United States, which is literally the whole world at this point, right? I mean, they're even now turning against the EU. And that's a dangerous path for us to go down. This may have made some sort of self-centered sense back when we considered the US as a friend. But now that this is changing, continuing to be an accomplice to US belligerents just draws us closer to their orbit and further justifies a takeover, right? So again, unless we assert ourselves independently and start building alliances with other countries, I think our situation is really dire. In terms of the military, there needs to be a decoupling of national defense and security from the United States, and this is going to be a tall order. We need to be able to protect the Canadian state from surveillance and infiltration. We need to build a military deterrence capability in relation to the United States. Again, Canadians don't like to think about this, but I think at some point we're going to have to do this. To this end, we could justify increasing spending on national defense to 2% of GDP, provided those investments focus on the United States as the primary military threat. Let's be real, who else is a military threat? It's completely absurd to think that Russia's going to invade us from the north or whatnot. Like, some people like to try and think that that's a thing. That's not a thing. It's never going to happen, right? The only country that might threaten us, that is threatening us, is the United States. We have to start acting that way as a country, not in terms of like being belligerent back to them, but doing what we need to do to make sure that we can actually defend ourselves. Another thing that may be controversial, but given the massive disparity in military power, the possibility of pursuing a Canadian nuclear weapons program should be seriously considered. As nuclear deterrence is one of the few things, unfortunately, that seems to afford countries a certain level of safety from US imperial aggression. The old sort of joke among political scientists is like, well, why did Iraq and Afghanistan get invaded, but not North Korea? Because North Korea has nuclear weapons, right? And as much as I'm no fan of that regime, it makes sense, right? If you have the ability to strike back, you have deterrence. And I mean, like I said, this may sound radical to a lot of Canadians, but France has nuclear weapons, the UK has nuclear weapons, and a number of our allies do. And this may be something we have to look at. So, apart from the heavy stuff there, how would we actually build a movement to get Canadians to start thinking about these things seriously? Well, to do so, we're going to have to build alliances between working people, the middle class, and even those sections of our domestic capitalist class that share some common goals. We know there are some business leaders and whatnot who are, they love Canada, they care about Canada, they're nationalists in their sentiment. So we need to be building alliances among all these groups. So this isn't a time for being hyper-sectarian or anti-nationalist. And again, I'm on the political left. A lot of leftists can be really bad that way, right? It's just like trash Canada all day long. That's not going to work, to move forward. We're going to have to move beyond that in politics. And we also need to pursue a strategy of accelerated outreach to and solidarity with people's movements and anti-imperialist forces in the United States. Again, Steve said that really appropriately in the meditation. We need to be clear that our quarrel is not with the people of the United States, and that in fact, we welcome them as friends and allies in our fight against fascism and empire. Our issue is with the American military machine and the American oligarchic class. Working people in both Canada and the United States have to struggle together in solidarity to overthrow the oligarchic classes, to take back control of our democracies, and to chart a path forward based on peace, sovereignty, prosperity, and sustainability for both our peoples. And so the two strategies, one of trying to do these nation-building things of improving our economy, making our military more self-sufficient, that strategy can work synergistically with the more social movement-based strategy. So first, the strategic mobilization of economic and political nationalism can protect against the immediate threat of military takeover and economic warfare. It's almost like we've got to, as fast as possible, develop some sort of economic deterrence, military deterrence, to give us a chance, right, to ride this out. And nation building can also kickstart the kind of economic policies needed to free Canada from the grip of US capital, to increase domestic manufacturing capacity, and to create good working class jobs. So this is the thing. We can't just counter tariff American goods and be like, everything's fine. We have to actually become self-sufficient as a country, more self-sufficient. I mean, countries are always going to trade, and we should be no different. But I'm telling you, if you look at the economies of the main competitor states to the US and the quote-unquote collective West, if you look at Russia, you look at China, even you look at India and whatnot, they are tripling down on building their domestic capacity. They're building their own economies. They're being very, very conscious about the fact of are they being owned? Are there major strategic industries owned by foreign companies or whatnot? You do not see that to the same extent you see in Canada. So we really have to be looking at this. And then also, working in conjunction with American working people and with movements can create conditions in which Canadian workers can exact concessions from our own domestic oligarchic class, which is really important. And so organized labor plays a critical role, and it's imperative that we also work in solidarity with US labor, so unions on both sides of the border. The struggle for higher wages, improved working conditions, and increased worker involvement in corporate and industrial decision-making is critically important. And without this, nationalism could just as easily be used as a tool to discipline labor, enact austerity, and weaken the working class. So to close out here, I know I've crammed a lot of big ideas into a short talk, and this has necessitated some broad strokes and some generalizations. And in fact, each of the things I've been talking about, the strategies, the proposals, requires extensive research, analysis, and debate. And if anything, I just hope that the talk will help facilitate a broader and more fulsome discussion and contribute to a conversation that's happening nationwide right now. And it's exciting that it is happening. In particular, it's important that we don't underestimate also the dangers of nationalist discourse in politics, because I've been talking about how do we mobilize nationalism in a productive way, but it has its dark side, right? Historically, nationalism has been clearly regressive and reactionary in many cases. It's been used to strengthen authoritarian political institutions, to suppress diverse identities, to push working people into imperialist wars, and to undermine class struggle. So all of these dangers are real. They need to be fully understood and guarded against. In addition, nationalism is perceived differently by various groups within Canada. Whether you're a woman, a man, white or racialized, LGBTQ, Native, and it has more oppressive connotations for many marginal groups. So you start waving the flag. Not everyone takes it immediately in the same way as a positive thing. And particularly, our status as a settler colonial state is very problematic, right? So a just legal and political relationship with Canada's First Nations is going to be critical to realize a left project of nation building. We need to be allies with the First Nations to develop our country, to develop, resources. They need to be full partners in this project. And basically, the perspectives and critiques of diverse groups need to be central to this work of building a new national identity. As well, we have to be aware that it's understandable that many parts of the world are going to have little sympathy for Canada's current plight, like outside of Europe, which is thankfully horrified at what's going on, and they are allies. But for a lot of other parts of the world, for decades, we've been a vassal state, essentially, of the US empire. We've engaged in our own neo-colonial and imperialist behaviors in Latin America, constantly trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. It's ridiculous that we keep doing that. Why? Because they have oil, right? We've been involved in Haiti as well, involved in overthrowing their government. So Canada's our hands are far from clean. In fact, we have a fair amount of blood on our hands. And again, most recently in supporting Israel's genocide against the Palestinians and also the destruction of Ukraine. So a project of left nation building does not involve denying or whitewashing this history. It's not like we all of a sudden step forward and be like, hey, we've always been the good guys. Sadly, we haven't been. Rather, it means ending this history, ending our role as a supporter of colonialism and imperialism, and instead charting a new course as an autonomous, neutral state within a democratic community of nations. And so, again, I'm going to leave off there, folks. I might have gone a little bit longer than I intended to. I know I just threw a lot at everyone, but hopefully it got some ideas going for what we might have to do as a country to really push back against this threat. And I think the last thing I'll say is that, in crisis, there is often opportunity. And I think Canada does have the opportunity to become a more moral country, a more just country, and like I said, a true member in a democratic community of states. And I think that could be very, very positive if we're able to pull that off. So thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.